All right, we're on our last chapter, social psychology. I've always enjoyed this. I think humans are social creatures, and it really explains a lot about our behavior with each other. We're going to start out with social cognition, how we perceive our social worlds, how we attend to, store, and remember social things, information about people. Um, Again, I can't overestimate just how social most human beings are. And when we meet each other, we want to be thought of positively. So there's a lot of impression management that's going on. We're managing our impression, but we're also, making an impression. People are forming judgments about us, and it's interesting. Research shows that people will really kind of begin to form these initial judgments about us within seconds. And if they like us, they're more likely to have this little halo effect. Like a lot of things about you, can kind of overlook, some of the negative things. And, vice versa. There's like a negative halo effect, reverse halo, and a primacy effect. The things you do early on are more heavily weighted than the things you do later on. So again, those initial impressions are very important. One of the things that we've learned too is that expectations that we have for other people can be very powerful and sometimes create a self-fulfilling prophecy. In this Rosenthal and Jacobson study, I'm not sure if we talked about this in intelligence, but teachers were told that a certain test predicted a student's academic potential, and some students were just randomly assigned to, look like stars, and others not so well. And what they found was, at the end of the year, those that had been labeled as quote unquote stars showed better improvements. I think it was in grades or achievement tests and whatnot. And they thought it was like a self-fulfilling prophecy where the teacher interacted with them in a way that created success, gave them more attention, challenged them more, things like that. But the end is the students performed as it was predicted and or expected. Self-fulfilling prophecy. Attitudes. We have a lot of attitudes about the world, and we engage in a lot of behaviors, and sometimes our attitudes and our behaviors don't always go hand in hand. It's a little bit more consistent than, we're a little bit more inconsistent than we would probably like. But when this happens, it creates something, a tension within us called cognitive dissonance. A real interesting study by, who was this? Festinger. Years ago, had people come in and do a boring task. Some people received $1 to do it. Some people received $20 to do it. And then they were asked to tell the person who was coming next that it was a fun task. And then later, after that, they were asked to actually rate the task itself. And the people that had received $1 said the task was enjoyable. The people who had received $20 said the task was not enjoyable. And I think what the dissonance was that somebody had been given $20 and instructed to tell somebody else that the task was fun. They had adequate justification for that little lie. Someone else would be given $1, and then they had to tell somebody that the task was fun. They had sort of inadequate justification for that lying, and since they couldn't change their behavior, what they had said, all they could do, in a sense, was change their attitude. And they ended up, saying that, and believing, I believe, that the task was less boring. You see this play out a lot of times when something like, I know cigarettes are bad for me, and yet I'm smoking cigarettes. That's probably true for most smokers, and that can lead to an unpleasant tension. And again, what can change? Well, the behavior or the attitude. So I could quit smoking to reduce that dissonance, or I can somehow convince myself that what I'm doing isn't unhealthy. So the research on smoking is not conclusive. I have good genes, or whatever. But again, you can see how cognitive dissonance could play out here. We have a lot of stereotypes in this world. It probably comes from our desire to understand people and to minimize the amount of mental energy that we use, and so we quickly categorize people. Unfortunately, this can lead to problems. Stereotypes are oftentimes not accurate for the entire group, let alone for an individual. And so, so stereotypes are a belief or a set of beliefs about people in a particular social category. So you may have beliefs about people who are overweight, or beliefs about teachers, or about young African American men, or whatever. These stereotypes exist. If I were to ask you just to say, if you wanted to tap into some of these stereotypes, whether you believed them or not, I'd have you go through this list: men, women, blondes, redheads, lawyers, scientists, professors, grade school teachers, physicians. And really, what's the first thing that pops into mind? Chances are that's a stereotype. The problem, with stereotypes, again, is many. Categorizing people is potentially problematic, and that information is often inaccurate. The problem is these stereotypes oftentimes remain, and they remain strong, because when we tend to, if we see stereotype consistent information, like like a cop eating donuts or something, we kind of prefer that information. We process it faster, we attend to it more, and we recall it faster. And so evidence that is sort of disconfirming, we don't really process or attend to or recall all the times we saw, cops eating carrots or something like that. So these stereotypes, can tend to persist some. Part of stereotypes, it leads to this kind of social categorization. Not entirely. We categorize people. This is part of our nature. We tend to divide the world into us and them, or my in-group, or you're the out-group. The problem is, again, if there's an out-group, there's this kind of illusory correlation, and we're paying attention to the stuff that is consistent with how we see that group. And there's this kind of illusion of out-group homogeneity. They're all the same, all blank people are this, but in-group differentiation. So people in your in-group, you can see the kind of subtle differences and whatnot, but we just kind of categorize the out-group in a real homogeneous way. And oftentimes this can lead to discriminatory behavior, a differential treatment or even mistreatment of an out-group. Again, there's a number of theories, this sort of social categorization theory, that we kind of naturally, it's human nature to create groups, to associate with certain groups, and to devalue other groups. There's a kind of more realistic conflict theory that says, no, there's more or less scarce resources in this world, and there's competition for that, and therefore, we kind of form groups so that we can, in a sense, have adequate resources, even if it means somebody else doesn't. Social learning theory is powerful. We see others, we learn by watching others, prejudice and discrimination. So this stuff, again, gets just modeled and learned. Attributions are another interesting key concept in social psychology. This is the explanation for the cause of an event or behavior. And so we seek to know the causes of a lot of things. We want to understand. Sometimes if it has to do with another person, behaving a certain way, we'll make sometimes internal or external attributions. Internal attributions are more dispositional attributions, like this is just the way they are. They're an angry person, they're a lazy person. External attributions are more situationally based, and that might be, they were just having a bad day, or they were mistreated in that situation. So you're kind of, somebody else provoked them. You're kind of attributing the cause of that behavior externally to the person rather than internally. We tend to have certain kind of attributional biases. The fundamental attribution error is this: we tend to attribute, again, this kind of these internal attributions to people that aren't us, and internal attributions to our own behavior. There does tend to be a self-serving bias where we attribute internal kind of stable global attributions to positive things, and more external and maybe less stable and less global attributions to negative things. That is, if you're kind of a non-depressed person. There is also this kind of belief in a just world. We do tend to sometimes want to believe that the world is a fair place, and so if something bad happens to someone, we tend to blame the victim. We tend to attribute it to their fault. Again, this is just sort of a little bit of human nature that people have observed. The whole idea of conformity and compliance and obedience has been a big area of study. So conformity is a change in beliefs or behavior because you feel pressure from others. The classic is peer pressure. Now, if you think about a time that you felt pressure to conform, you might have felt some sort of internal tension. If you did conform, you may have felt a certain way. You could have felt bad. If you didn't conform, you may have felt self-conscious. So there's a real power to conform. So why do people conform? A couple different reasons. We'll talk about that in a minute, but a classic study of conformity was Ash's studies, where he had people come in, and all of those people were Confederates, with the exception of maybe the one of the last people. And they would show people lines, and they would ask them which line matched, and which line matched. Normally, all the Confederates would go first. After a few trials, everybody would be in agreement, and then all of a sudden, in a later trial, everybody, I would say like, for this one, line 3, when it's clearly line 2. And so you'd have, 3, 4, 5 people ahead of you say something that you know is wrong. The question is, do you go against that group? And Ash showed that people, over a third of the time, went along with the group even when they knew it was wrong. Again, they didn't know these people, but there was just this tremendous pressure, I think, to conform. It was peer pressure, but again, it wasn't even like peer pressure from friends or a social group. So, why do people conform? Well, there's a couple different reasons. And they've been labeled kind of informational social influence and normative social influence. Now, informational social influence is this idea that I went along with him or changed my views or behavior because the group must be right. So how could everybody be wrong and I be right? So the group, kind of leads you to what you believe is the correct answer. Then there's the normative social influence, where you kind of say, well, they're wrong, but I don't want to disagree with them. I don't want to be, I don't want to be disliked. They seem like nice, normal people. I don't want to be seen as weird. So one is the informational social influence, they just kind of question their own judgment. Well, I must be wrong. Normative, they don't really question their own judgment, but they don't want to be sort of disliked, so they conform. What diminishes conformity? Well, if you see someone else, another nonconformist, you're more likely to break ranks, or if there's privacy. So if it was anonymity in responding, so the public aspect of that is pretty important of conformity. So what about, now we've gone from conformity, what's obedience? Well, this is compliance with an order from an authority figure. Somebody who has at least a minimal amount of authority over you. And again, I want to think about this. Can you think of a time when you were ordered to do something. Were you disobedient, and how did you feel? Again, sometimes if you're disobedient, you feel guilty. Sometimes if you're obedient but you didn't want to be, you feel upset. Again, these are situations that can really cause a lot of inner tension. And so the question is, why are people obedient? And we'll talk about that. One of the classic studies in this area is Milgram. A little bit of the background: Milgram had people come in. They thought they were taking part in a learning experiment. They thought that the person that you see strapped in here was a Confederate, but they thought that randomly they had been assigned the teacher and the other person had been assigned the learner. So they hooked this person up in a room, and they tell you, this person's going to get shocked when they get, information wrong, and increasingly shocked, and we're going to see if that improves learning. And then they had this, you went in a different room, and they had this crazy device that kind of implied that there would be increasing shock when the person, got things wrong. Now, this was all a sham. The person did not get shocked, and it was all sort of pre-recorded and whatnot, all standardized. But what happened was, this little panel on that machine went from 115 to 450 volts, and at some point it said X X X. No, like I said, it was staged so that at 120 volts the learner would shout in pain. At 150 they'd have to stop. 300 volts the learner would pound on the wall. And then at 330 volts, they would stop responding, which is just crazy. They would even say they had a heart condition. And then the experimenter would just say to them, if they asked to quit, the experimenter was kind of standing there in a white coat and just said, you have to continue. So how far will the teachers go? Well, they asked psychiatrists to predict, who is going to, give the maximum level of shock. And psychiatrists said, you're lucky to get 2%. But in reality, 65% of the teachers went all the way to the maximum level. This is mind-blowing, because remember, the person's yelling and screaming. They stop responding after 330 volts. So there, and if you look at some of the films of this, there's just real. You can tell the tremendous. Just tension and shock and discomfort in these people as they administered the shock. And they went on to try to study this, and they learned that as the victim got closer, compliance dropped. As the authority figure got closer, or standing next to versus being in another room, obedience dropped. The legitimacy of the authority had a pretty big effect. So if the authority was legitimate, then you were more likely to be obedient. If it was a less legitimate, sort of in a seedy office building, you were more likely to be disobedient. And if you had a reference group, if that person, if there's somebody before you, you saw them break off, you'd be much more likely to break off. And I think it went the other way too, though. But if they went all the way, you were even more likely to go all the way. And there's some ethical issues. This study had been repeated many times, but there are some kind of ethical issues with it. The people that participated didn't seem to be harmed, but they were under a lot of duress and stress when they did this experiment. I think, what does the experiment teach us in general about human nature? Well, from a very early age, we are taught to be obedient to authority figures. What we're not taught, I think, is how to be disobedient in times when we're asked to do things that are wrong, morally reprehensible or wrong, and it leaves us susceptible to doing things that go against our nature. Then there's compliance. Compliance is, sort of halfway, I think, kind of almost between obedience and conformity, where somebody just, asks you to do something. Hey, will you do this for me? They don't have authority over you. But research has shown that there are certain things that increase whether you will comply or not. If you like the person, you will comply. If you've complied to similar requests in the past, you will tend to comply. If you think that whatever they're asking you to do is kind of rare, or it's unlikely to happen again, or something, you're likely to comply. If you think they will, be reciprocal in the future and kind of help you out, you're more likely to comply. If the person seems similar to you, and or of course, if they're an authority figure, but you're more likely to comply. Another area that had generated some interest years ago was helping others or not helping others. Certainly, there does seem to be a lot of altruism in the world, people helping out each other. They do a lot of great things. But this Catherine Genovese was murdered outside of her apartment, and screaming and stuff, and nobody came to her. No one helped or called the police. And when they talked about it afterwards to people in the apartment, they knew something was going on, and a lot of people just didn't want to get involved, or thought other people would get involved, and felt kind of weird calling. And what they realized is that there was this bystander effect that was occurring, kind of a mixture of this evaluation apprehension, like, should I be calling, how will I be judged, and this diffusion of responsibility, well, someone else will take care of it. And we see this time and time again, in a variety of different scenarios. One bystander experiment is this smoke-filled room where, you're sitting there and taking this test with somebody else who's a Confederate. Smoke is pouring in the room, and that person is pretending like they don't care. And how long does it take before you mention something, or go out and report the smoke in the room? And it's interesting, again, if you're by yourself, you go out pretty quickly, but if there's people that and even friends, it decreases the likelihood that you're going to report it. And if there's a Confederate that seems, like they don't care, you're even less likely to report it. Roles, part of an important part of what we do in this world, we have certain roles. They can be very powerful. This particular study by, and I have this is one of those, I think I have a video, and I have a few videos for some of these social psych experiments. Definitely check them out. These video links that I have under the modules. But in this one, he randomly assigned some people to be prisoners and some to be guards, and it was incredible just how kind of mean and sadistic the guards became, and how kind of submissive the prisoners became, because they were given these arbitrary roles. And Zimbardo realized, wow, people will really do stuff that's out of character, if it somehow to be consistent with these roles. They were relating this a lot to this Abu Ghraib prison incident years ago, and I think it was Iraq or Afghanistan, where some of the prisoners were just really abused by the guards and whatnot, and saying, again, is it something to do with giving these people this role that kind of made them do this kind of horrible stuff. A lot of social psychology studies relationships and liking of people. We tend to like people, romantically, if we have a lot of contact with them, if they're similar to us. Of course, physical attraction, that's pretty obvious. There's been a fair amount on love. The question is there some sort of soulmate for you, and what does falling in love feel like, and does that feeling last forever, and how does it change? People say there's kind of a passionate love, that you normally see sometimes in the beginning of relationships. Some people maintain it throughout, and a companionate love, this is a best friend companion. Sternberg had a triangular model of love, and he said, to have love, really you need not only passion, but intimacy, a certain amount of closeness, and commitment. You need to be committed to the other person. Many of us belong, again, we're social creatures. We belong to organizations, social organizations. They tend to have a lot of common elements. the members interact. There is at least a modicum or emotional connection, maybe a lot. These organizations have a common frame of reference or understanding. They're interdependent, and they tend to have norms and roles, like certain rules and certain roles. These roles may be standard and hierarchical, and they tend to have hierarchies where some people are higher status and others are lower. And sometimes we can feel kind of so strongly attached to those groups that we kind of de-individuate. We have a group think that sort of goes on. One of the problems, though, with groups, and particularly as they get homogeneous, is that they actually get more extreme. Even though you would think that more people in a group have, you'd have more opinions and it may be more conservative response. It doesn't tend to happen. Groups tend to polarize, and they engage in this kind of group think. And the more kind of homogeneous and close they are, the more likely they are, I think, to make extreme decisions. I think that's it for social psychology. Definitely check out some of the links I have, and thank you. Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot to mention social loafing, social compensation, and social facilitation. Groups, oftentimes, and we talked about this kind of diffusion of responsibility, but usually when you're in a group, you loaf a little bit, you do a little less work. Sometimes there's social facilitation or social compensation, but usually the general rule is that groups, don't really facilitate or make you, behavior. You tend to see social loafing. So, there we go. Thanks. Bye.